Welcome to the Echo Podcast, where we discuss how our hearts and minds can be an echo of God's heart and mind and what that even means in this world. We're Pastor Dan Sinkhorn and Adrienne Tarullo from Shiloh Church of Jasper, Indiana, and we've gone pulpit to podcast. We hope you enjoy today's episode of talking about respect. We'll just start there. Respect. So this is part 2 of our youth podcast. Is that what we called it?
Well, it was rooted in the fact that I did a message Sunday called Worthy of Respect, and it was about trying to recognize the contributions that young people can make to the life of the church and why we need to encourage that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we'll just jump right in. This was, I really enjoyed it. And, man, I don't even know where to start. There's so many thoughts going through my head. This is such good stuff. Of course, I'm jazzed about this because this is kind of my bread and butter, right? Working
Sure.
with the youth and the teenagers. And,
Well, I was I'll see if I can help you because, most of the time when I preach, I am either dissatisfied, very satisfied, or indifferent after the fact. Now, what I mean by that is that after I preach a sermon, I'm always wondering if I did what I set out to do. And sometimes I'm satisfied that I did, and sometimes I'm dissatisfied. And sometimes I'm indifferent because I'm not getting a strong sense after the fact whether I believe I did what I set out to do, but I'm not feeling particularly excited about it. It's difficult to understand what I'm driving at here if you don't do this for a living, but I'm always happiest when I finish preaching and I think that I did what I set out to do. What usually happens is even when I'm not sure whether that happened, people will still tell me that they heard the voice of God and that they got something good out of it. And so, I have to kind of accept that God shows up as long as I don't get too full of myself and don't get in the way. So it was a satisfying sermon Sunday. I was content afterwards because I went into it a little anxious. And the reason was because I was really hoping that I could strike a balance. I didn't, I had the parable of Martin, right? And that was going to be hard for some people to hear because they either know a Martin that, sits in their Sunday school class or they are Martin, And I didn't want anybody to go away thinking that I was picking on somebody or that I was trying to shame or embarrass anybody. I didn't want anybody to go away thinking that my whole mission was to elevate youth and put down the old. I was very anxious that this would be a polarizing message in some way. And I was really satisfied because with the Lord's help, it came out really balanced. Mm-hmm. And I didn't sense that anybody would have a just reason for thinking that they had been dealt with unfairly. So worthy of respect at the end of the message seemed to apply to both young and old, either in that they should receive respect or that they should give respect.
Yeah, and I thought you did deliver that really well. And I do think the youth and the older people are worthy of respect. And it's sometimes challenging, I think, and can be polarizing. And it's this tension that can weaken the church, right? Like you put in this subtitle, it can weaken the church when pride gets in the way. Mm-hmm. Whether that's it doesn't matter what age you are. Everyone can feel prideful at some point about something. And so I think it's so important that no matter how old you are checking your pride constantly. Like I heard you say today, you were talking about something not really related to this, but kind of. And you said, a piece of advice I would give to a future person would be to check your pride at the door.
Yeah.
And then just lead with humility. And I think that's so true. I see pride in the youth in that they think they know better for some reason. Like they've walked on the earth for long enough that they know that the old ways aren't the right ways, right? But you also see pride in the older generation because they develop this sense of entitlement of like, well, I've been here for so long, I've built this church, I've earned my keep, basically. And you young kids have no idea what it's really like to be me. You have no idea how much I've grieved, how much I've lost, how much I've given. And I think, honestly, there might be a little bit of truth in both of those, but that doesn't mean it's a green light to just live your life in a prideful way. And I think it's important that we just recognize where that pride can live in all of us so that we can move forward together. Because as I was reading through this to prepare for the podcast, something just kept coming into my brain. It was this just 2-word phrase, and I just kept thinking, pride divides. Pride divides.
Yeah.
And that's the entire nature of what pride does. Because if you're prideful in what you've done and what you've accomplished, you're essentially thinking, well, I'm better than this person who hasn't accomplished this. And suddenly there's this big divide between the two of you, right? There's pride in the older and younger generations that we just described that really divides them, especially when they tell each other how they feel prideful. And so I think it's so important, no matter how old you are, to operate your life with humility.
Yeah.
Instead of just thinking, you know better and all of this. Now, I will say, as a younger person, I guess, who leads younger people, the world is a very different place than what it once was. And we talked a little bit last week about how technology has affected that. And I say that, but I'm also thinking, well, human nature hasn't really changed all that much.
Right.
We're still throwing stones at each other. It's just on social media now, right? It's a little bit more cowardly than it once was, right? We used to like physically throw stones at people. But now we're just saying off the wall comments and being really hurtful and isolating and, dividing, divisive.
Yeah.
So that's what I got from the sermon, and I thought it was well balanced, and that you were telling everyone, here's how it can present in the old, here's how it can present in the young, and here's how we can overcome that and come together. And I saw that through the parable of Martin.
Well, I think I see you have the sermon notes in front of you. I think, if I remember right, the last paragraph of the last somewhere in the conclusion, it says, I wrote in my notes, basically, the secret is that we've got to communicate with each other, that we have to take the risk of getting to know each other. And one of the things that you have to overcome if you're older is your assumption that this is still a kid that you're talking to. Like when Jesus said that there's, a prophet is always rejected in his own hometown. That's one of those that I've ruminated over for decades, like the sins of the father passage, stuff like that. Certain passages have stuck with me for a long time because I keep coming back to different ways to interpret it. And when he said that, I think it's really simple. He grew up in Nazareth, which was a small village in its day, in his day, and everybody knew him. It wasn't just a small town. It was a small town where everybody was related, and everybody knew him. Some people might have even known him as Mary's illegitimate child. Like they may have even thought of him that way. So their natural tendency when he comes back as a man and he speaks the truth direct from God in their synagogue, their natural reaction is to, just want to throw him out and kill him, or, just have a really bad reaction to him. You uppity so and so. And one of the hardest things that we deal with, most of us anyway, is when we go to family gatherings, we immediately assume the roles we had when we were kids. Mm-hmm. And we don't do it necessarily because we want to, but it's like you pick up where you left off. I was talking with my bride the other day, and it's like, she and I have lived together longer than I lived with my siblings. So who do I know better? And I knew my siblings as children who were growing and maturing, and they knew me as a child who was growing and maturing. So they really don't know the person I've become as well as my own wife has, because you keep growing up even after you become an adult. My son likes to say there's really no such thing as an adult, because what is an adult but someone who's older than someone else? And so we're all children if we're not all adults, and vice versa, So anyway, the problem with people getting to know each other is that we have to put our assumptions aside. And so what you're calling pride, which I think I'd like to unpack pride, I really would. But to start with, at the very least, the pride is a very subtle need to assume our assumptions are correct. But we don't want to have our assumptions challenged because of our pride. So when you grow up in the church, let's say, like some of our staff here did, and suddenly you become a young adult who's on the staff, the adults who are in the pews are having a hard time accepting you as an adult member of the staff, because they remember you when you were the little kid that was up on the stage singing the song, for the children's choir, and it's like, yep. And then I grew up and I became an adult member of this congregation, and it's hard. We have to dismiss those roles. I want my siblings, who are all old people, right? I want all my siblings to respect me and recognize me as the adult person that I am. And yet, even though we're all old, we still think we know each other because we know each other the way we did when we were kids. And there's this need for our assumptions to remain true, because it hurts my pride to admit that I don't know my brother. I don't know my sister. I haven't been around them hardly at all for the last 40 years, and that hurts my pride. And what do I do with that? And so if I unpack pride, because I was thinking about this when you were talking, and I was thinking, pride, I think, is a word that you could put on a spectrum. I suppose you could do this with lots of words. But you could put pride on a spectrum, and you could say that way over here on one side, pride is about vanity. It's about egotism. It's about, arrogance, right? And then at the far other end of the spectrum, pride is fear. Pride, some things that look like pride are really fear. The fear of growing old, the fear of being, having fewer years in front of you than you do behind you. And, realizing that you have disconnected, let's say, from your siblings and you really don't know them it's a fulfillment of a fear, You're acting proud because you're sort of saying, no, I'm not afraid of that. I just think that you think you've changed more than you have. You still sound like the same old person. So they kind of react with this sort of negative energy because they're confronted with a fear. And sometimes we act negatively because we're afraid. So I think on one end of the spectrum, you've got fear, and on the other end, you have just pure vanity, And in the middle, well, there's even a place where taking pride in doing a job well, not such a bad thing, I take a little pride in the fact that my sermon was communicated effectively. Well, that's not so bad, really, because that's just a way, I think, of saying I have self-respect. And so that puts me on yet another variation on the theme that pride can be as innocuous as self-respect, but it can be as toxic as self-esteem. And there's a big difference, right? We're going into the month that's known as Pride Month now, and there's going to be all these people, and I don't know anything about the Pride movement. I really don't. What I mean by that is I don't know how, who came up with the name. I don't know how that particular community of people arrived at the conclusion, but I assume that what they're saying is I'm not ashamed of who I am and what I am, and so I'm going to be proud of that. And I think that on the surface, that's good. That's not harmful, except that it probably is toxic because it's not a statement of self-worth and self-respect as much as it is anger with a world that they are convinced won't accept them or something, So there's where that fear part kicks in. It's like, okay, there's nothing wrong with you saying I have enough self-respect to accept who I am and to expect you to do the same, at least where our lives converge. Okay, I can get on board with that. But when it becomes sort of a violent or toxic expression of self-esteem or anger because of fear, see, and that's what I mean. Like it's like right in the middle of the spectrum of things. Pride's not a bad thing because it's self-respect. It's being able to take to esteem or respect something that you did well or that was done well. Like being proud of our church because of all that it has endured, and it's like those things aren't too bad. So right in the middle, those things are all kind of okay. But down here on the fear side and up here on the ego side, they behave very much the same way. There's different motivations, but they're basically the same outcomes. They're pushing people away. So bringing it back to the whole young people and older people in the church thing, why do young people push away healthy relationships with older people? Probably fear, because they're assuming that they'll be disrespected and treated like children, and not unjustly, because maybe that's true. But then why do people who are older tend to reject the youth? Because they're afraid. Because they're afraid that all the old things are going to be invalidated somehow. All the familiar things are going to be invalidated. That's what the whole story of Martin is. Martin became so discouraged and depressed because now if you haven't heard this, folks, it won't make much sense to you, but I wrote a little parable called the Parable of Martin, and it was really just a description of the kind of person that comes to church and just gets angrier and angrier every week because nothing feels the same anymore, and the point is that he's stuck, and there's lots of people in church who are stuck. They're stuck because they can't figure out how to go with the flow, and it would feel safer to them if things would just stay the same. And that really has nothing to do with your age. It really doesn't have anything more to do with that than it has with your spirit of adventure, let's say. Well, it turns out older people aren't as adventurous. And I think, this is your podcast, so I don't want you to think I'm taking it away, but I think the most profound thing the Lord gave me in that message was when I realized and stated for everybody that the biggest difference between young people and older people is young people have less life experience and therefore less grief. Older you get, the more grief you have absorbed. The older you get, the more grief you've experienced. And grief, in my definition, and as the way I used it Sunday, is the loss, the sense of permanent loss. You know, that when you realize something has changed forever and you can't change it back. And obviously, when we think of the death of a loved one or something, that makes perfect sense because they're gone and we can't bring them back. And yet, what else in your life has gone that you can't get back? You know, you haven't reached the point in your life, but you're probably getting close.
Yeah.
Where you will grieve your youth because you realize you're not a kid anymore, or even a young, adult teenager. You're going to realize you're entering the middle area where, you're 30 something, and that comes with grief.
Yeah. I was going to say that'll probably kick in December when I hit the big 3-0.
Yeah. And when the parents, when the parents die and the grandparents die, all these things start to add up. And by the time you're 60, 70 years old, you've absorbed a lot of grief. And many people in their 60s and 70s have lost spouses, or they've lost children. They've lost their parents. Their kids have moved away and started families of their own. They've moved out of the communities they grew up in, maybe so they can live nearer to their kids and their grandkids. They've seen their church change, like Martin. They saw their friends die off. They saw their parents die off. They saw people get mad and quit because, of the disaffiliation. They saw people leave because of the pandemic, and they realized that they just didn't need church as much as they thought they did, and so they never came back. And so the older you get, the more of a cumulative effect grief has. And you become really resistant to experiencing any more grief because it's like a weight. And it's ironic that your body and your mind, as you get older, become less vital and vibrant than they once were. And yet you're carrying more weight emotionally than ever before in your life. It just keeps piling up. And so you have the combination of the decline of your body and the relative decline of your mind, because that's more variable. But you have this over the hump status in life where you realize you're further from birth and closer to the grave. And you have that, and you combine it with your sense of grief that you've just acquired so much grief. You've experienced so much loss. You've seen so much change. And you get to a point where you just think, man, if there's just one thing in my life that doesn't change, it would be so nice. And most people who go to church, they kind of want church to stay the same because they figure if there's one thing that can, it ought to be my church. And then somebody comes along and says, well, church changes too. And so that was one of the biggest things I think I said to people and I think that's why I wanted to talk about that spectrum, because people's behavior can look like pride, but I think it's fear. And I think especially when you look at how older people respond to change in the church, it's fear, but we tend to, what's the word I want to use? We tend to trivialize that fear as though it's about fear of change. Like, oh, you're just afraid of change. Well, let's unpack that a little bit, because this is where getting to know people and understanding where they come from makes all the difference. Because if you understand that these are people who have borne so much more grief than, at 70 than you have at 30, right? I mean, take that.
29, thank you, but
you just, yeah.
You're good.
I think it's a guy thing, because when I'm closer to the next birthday, I just start calling myself that.
Sure, yeah.
I turned 62, so I'm going to be 62 for a while. But come December, I'll probably start referring to myself as 63, because I can see it from there.
And your birthday's May.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, that's just kind of how I am. But anyway, if you look at this person, and I want to talk about the young people too, but when you look at the older person and you look at how they respond, realize that this person, some of them have just had more grief than they think they can bear. And that is, and this is where the Martin parable really hits home, is I'm trying to think of the right way to say this with sensitivity. To a certain extent, your capacity to deal with grief is up to you. Like you can decide how much grief you're willing to bear, and you can reframe the grief, and you can. So I think that what happens to older people and people of all ages when they get stuck is that they've stopped doing their spiritual and emotional exercise. You know, like you got to do your critical thinking. You know, how many times have we talked about that critical thinking? And I think that people who fail to do their critical thinking limit their capacity to handle grief, for example. You know, I was just having a conversation with my bride the other day because I was trying to practice what I preach, you know. And I said, well, if I'm honest, I'm just grieving. You know, at first it sounded like I was complaining to her about something, you know, that had changed in our lives. And I thought, well, no, I'm not really like I don't want you to try to fix it. I know you can't. Any more than, you know, this is a real stretch. This will mean more to you than our listeners because you know me. But, you know, I've grown up loving railroading and all this, and my favorite railroad was the Monon. Well, it's been virtually abandoned. That railroad is rail trails in certain places or just gone altogether in other places. But I actually remember riding those rails, watching trains on those rails. And now when I go by places where the rails used to be, I grieve because my grief is a way of acknowledging that something changed forever. Something that had always been dependable and reliable for me was being able to see railroad activity in this place, and now it's gone. And in certain places it's been systematically wiped out, like the memory of it has been deliberately erased and replaced with something else. So it hurts. And it doesn't just hurt, it also kind of adds to this grief over growing older and growing closer to the grave than to birth, you know, and so it has that kind of, and what I did in order to practice what I preach is I said, you know, honey, I probably eventually stopped saying how much this grieves me, but right now I'm not done grieving. So grief is, you know, as like we could do a whole episode on the stages of grief because it's pretty legit.
Yeah.
But the reality is in most cases when you're grieving, you know, you're in denial, then you're angry. Then you try to, you know, negotiate a way to keep what you want, you know. Like, well, I'll tell you what, if you don't change this, I'll do this or I'll do that. And then when you realize that's not going to work either, then you ease into acceptance. And the acceptance takes a long time, but eventually it becomes peace. And I don't know that it always feels peaceful, though. I wonder if it doesn't also just feel like resignation. You know, like, well, I have to accept it. That's just all there is to it. I can't change the way it is. And I think that's what you find when you're talking to people who have lost loved ones. And I especially, you know, I know a lot of parents who have lost children. And I've done the funerals for these children and stuff like this. So, I mean, I've been really close to it. And what they tell you is well, you never get over it. You just get used to it. It's a resignation. It's a realization that all your grieving, all your tears hasn't changed anything. So there's just no point in crying anymore, you know? And I think that is both sad and liberating at the same time, because the acceptance isn't necessarily like celebrating it. You know, it's not like you're going, oh, well, this was a good thing. You're not saying that. You're saying this was a bad thing. It'll always be a bad thing, and I will always grieve it.
Yeah.
But I've made my peace with it because there's just nothing left in me to give to that problem. So bringing it full circle, these are the people, young people, that didn't come out right. These are the older people that I want young people to understand. I want them to understand that everybody over a certain age is dealing with a cumulative grief that has taken a toll on them. And some of them reframe it better and they process it better and they respond better. Because, one of the other things I said in the sermon that I was particularly pleased with was that I was saying you can regain your youth. You can retain a little bit of the joy that used to be in you by living vicariously through the young people around you. You can encourage a young, enthusiastic person to take up a calling that you once carried. And you can be there to encourage them with your wisdom and your support. And in a way, you can be inspired by them. You've heard me say many times that if I'm guilty of anything that would be offensive to the older members of our congregation, it is that I prefer the company of the young. Well, it's not that I have anything against the older people. It's just that when I'm around younger people like you, I get inspired, I get enthusiastic, I don't feel so old.
Yeah, yeah. That's such a good perspective for me to hear personally, and I think for a lot of younger people, because I agree with you that the grief was probably one of the most profound things in the whole sermon. And, I was sitting here trying to process through that of, I've had a lot of change in my life too, and why is it that I continue to bounce back and be okay and just keep moving forward? Whereas with the older generation, it's like they hit a point and it's like you said, it just keeps compounding and they're just like, oh my goodness, I can't take one more thing. What's the difference there? And it's the grief and it's the mourning the loss of a life that one thinks is better than what it is now. That's the difference, because they were young and vital and had bouncy joints or whatever, like their bodies were better, their minds were better.
You just reminded me, I'm sorry, you just reminded me of something. I just heard on a podcast yesterday something really fascinating, that an extensive survey was done of all variety of ages of people, of when was the best era in American history. And they're asking living people. And the researchers realized after they compiled all the data that there wasn't a clear answer to when, but there was a very clear statement of the best era we all remember is the one when we were around 17 to 20.
Wow.
That we consider the best music when we were about 17 to 20. The best movies when we were about 17 to 20. The best times, the best economy, the best everything. It all seems to us like it was about the time we were 17 to 20. Huh. And so it turns out that nobody really thinks of a particular time as being the time when the music was the best. It's relevant to how old they were at the time. So, and the fascinating thing about that is that we know from, really solid medical science that that's when our bodies peak. That's when we peak. When we're about 25, our bodies are on the decline already. You're a therapist, you know what I'm talking about here. You peak, most males peak around 25 and most females, I think it's a little sooner if I'm not mistaken, but
it might be. Yeah.
And it probably has a little bit to do with childbirth and stuff like that. But the reality is that of course we have risen to our prime right about then. And so that is the time when we feel the best about life. That's when we have the most positive attitude about life, is when we're in our teens and early 20s. And by the time we get to 30, we're starting to get a little bit jaded about certain things because, well, for one thing, you grow up a lot more than 10 years worth between 20 and 30.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a fact. That's a fact. You ask anybody in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and they'll tell you that when they were living their 20s, their teens and their 20s, they were growing up a lot more than the years would indicate.
Yeah.
So by the time you get to 30, most people have kind of figured some things out. And if we survive all the stupid things we did around 20, then we can talk about it when we're 30 is like, wow, and so surprisingly, but I didn't mean to cut you off, but it was just like, it goes along with exactly what you're saying.
It does.
Like that's even been statistically proven now, that we all look at, and by the way, the same report said that everybody thinks right now is the worst time.
Oh.
No matter how old they are.
Really? Like the present is the worst. Wow.
Yeah.
That's so intriguing, because that's kind of where I was going with all that anyway. Is like, I'll cut to the chase. It's a matter of mindset. Mm-hmm. It's totally a matter of mindset. For me, my mindset has been, I'm always changing. I'm always bouncing back. I wanted to go off on a tangent there, but I'm not going to. But for me, it's always trying to get better, always improving, always this, always pushing, right? And so I'm thinking, okay, I can be better today than I was tomorrow, or than I can be better today than I was yesterday, right? Even if it's 1% or whatever. And so that's how I live my life. And yet, even though studies show that the body starts devolving at 25 or whatever it is, you can still make improvements. Like, you can still, like, I follow a lot of, I hate this word, but influencers, right?
Yeah.
On social media, and especially like in the physical therapy world. And there are so many people who say they're in better shape now in their 50s than they were in their 20s. Mm-hmm. And you're like, wait, what? And so you immediately get this attention to them of like, that's not the normal status quo. Normally 50-year-olds look at me and they say, oh, to be young again. I get that all the time. Like daily. I mean, people say, you have no idea how good it is to be young or whatever. And it just goes on and on. And so I'm intrigued by these people, and what they found is typically they had some sort of injury, some sort of sports-related injury, and they've had surgery after surgery, and they've rehabbed, and they've figured out the right potion for them that gets them back on their feet in better shape than they were, feeling better, running, doing all of these active things, feeling so much better than they did 20, 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so you see that it's possible. It's just a matter of mindset. That's taken years, countless hours of work and dedication and believing that they can. And that's a physical analogy because I think physically a lot, but that's mentally too.
Oh, absolutely.
Like today, no matter how old you are, could be the best day of your life.
Yep. It
could be, if you let it.
Well, and if there's one thing that I know from living so many years now is of course it can be, because tomorrow could be, life turns on a dime.
Yeah. Things
change in a second. Your whole life could come to a screeching halt at any moment simply because something changed in a profound way. Someone died, or to put it far less dramatically, you got handed your notice. You went to work thinking it was just going to be another day, and you get told you're no longer needed. Life changes so suddenly because things happen that you weren't expecting, and as soon as you're confronted with the unexpected, you've just encountered a grief moment, and you have to decide how to frame it.
Yeah.
And the older you get, the less willing you are to kind of sugarcoat it and kind of look at it with rosy tinted glasses. You just have to. I think it takes a little more mental energy and emotional energy, and I think it takes a little bit of more patience. A word I really like, perspicacity.
What is that? I can't even say it.
Perspicacity.
Perspicacity.
Yeah, it's a word that just kind of describes somebody that has that resilience and that persistence and that kind of drive and determination. It's a it's yeah,
It sounds like they took parts of many words and put them together into one word.
probably.
Perseverance,
Yeah.
something about capacity. Anyway.
Yeah, I like that. I like, well, so people of every age, they have to be willing to do the critical thinking, and they have to be willing to reframe things. The old glass is half empty versus half full. And I just think, like, when young people get stuck, it's usually because they haven't acquired enough life experience and wisdom. And I want to make this very clear. I've said this to my own children when they were teenagers and they were doing what teenagers do to their parents. And I would say to them, look, I want you to really understand that I don't think you're stupid. I think you're very intelligent. I just know that I've lived a longer time than you have, and that means I've seen a few more things than you, done a few more things than you, and I have a longer list of things that I know can be problematic. Like sometimes when I tell you this is a bad idea, it's because I've already done that one myself several times, or I've seen how it worked out for other people, and I made note of that. Like it's really important to recognize that that's what wisdom is. And wisdom, unfortunately, is something you can only get with age. You don't get wisdom early on. Now, some younger people have a kind of a sort of extraordinary wisdom, and I think that's a gift from God. It's kind of an insight, that you get where you're able to, because a lot of times young people have been exposed to enough information and input to make wise decisions, but they don't tend to do that because they haven't categorized those experiences and quantified them and figured out how to use them as wisdom. So ironically, they don't have the wisdom to use the wisdom they have.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And some young people do. They're better than that for some reason. But the vast majority of us, when we're young, we've already accumulated quite a lot of wisdom, but we don't have the maturity to apply that wisdom and to recognize it for what it is. I used to tell my kids when they were teenagers, if it seems like a dumb idea, it probably is.
Yeah.
And whoops, my phone tried to ring. It's just the doctor's office trying to tell me that I have an appointment. Anyway, people, I used to tell my kids, be careful, be wise when they go out with their friends. And along those lines, I would say, because if your friends decide to do something that seems like a bad idea to you, you're probably right, Yeah. So don't go along with it. Be the guy that saves them all from each other,
Right.
And I guess my kids did that to a certain extent, but we'll never know because there's things kids never tell their parents, and
yeah,
that's just how it is. And then when you get to a certain age as a parent, you go, I lived this long without knowing that. I don't need to know it now. My mother said that to me all the time, and she's 92 and I'm 62. So, we have a capacity to draw on our life experience and use it in a positive way, but so many of us become overwhelmed with our negative life experiences. And that's where I was going a few minutes ago. It's like, even if you're young, you can get stuck because your lack of wisdom makes you see something that looks insurmountable to you. And an older person will say, we can do this. We can do this. And that's usually when I'm more likely to see a young person enthusiastically embrace the friendship with an older person, is because they have a goal. This young person has a goal, and this older person looks competent and looks like they actually do know the way. And so they go, you can reach your goal, but it looks impossible because it's going to be very difficult to get there. But I can show you how to get there. Yeah. I can help you get there. See, that's where the collaboration between young and old is really remarkable. And it turns out that an older person who has the same sense that everything is just too much for them, they kind of need a young person that comes alongside them and says, "Oh, it's all right. You know what? I'll help you. We'll get through this. So it's perspective. Sometimes a young person sees something that truly is beyond their ken, or their knowledge, right? And they need an older person to show them how you can get that done, how you can accomplish your goals. And then sometimes an older person needs a young person to give them a dose of unbridled enthusiasm that just says, well, I don't know how hard this is going to be, but I know you can do it. Let's go. Come on. And see, that's what we can give each other. It's a gift of wisdom on one side and a gift of enthusiasm and energy on the other side. And the person who is mired in grief at 70 years old, let's say, they kind of need young people around them to urge them on and encourage them. I think I said in the message that one of the joys of being a grandparent, despite the fact that I'm not comfortable with being old enough to be a grandparent, is walking around with my 3-year-old granddaughter and seeing the world through her eyes.
Yeah.
Because it freshens my whole perspective. I helped my son build a play set for her the other day, and she climbed up on it and she said, "I'm on top of the world," and well, from her perspective, that was way up.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's just like, that's it's a little easier for a grandparent with grandchildren, but I think even certain grandparents, it's like, some people just act old. And they kind of feel like that's their mission in life, is to act old.
Yeah.
And they were doing it when they were young, and there are people that are young who never really grow up. And so when you get to 35 or 40 years old and you're still trying to act like you're a teenager, somebody needs to slap you upside the head and, slap you on the back of the head and say, "Grow up!" I think I mentioned it in last week's podcast, but when I was really sick a few weeks ago, one of the things I came out of the fog thinking was, gosh, an awful lot of the frustration I experience with church people comes down to people that haven't grown up, that they're still acting like children. And sometimes it's the 70-year-olds that are still acting like children, and sometimes it's 40-year-olds that are still acting like children, and sometimes it's children acting like children. But you can't, I think I feel like I'm going a little circular here, but at the end of the day, I think if I was trying to give advice to anybody, it would just be, don't get stuck. Like, you got to know when you're stuck or when you're about to get stuck. If you've ever driven your car on a slushy, snowy road, you know that at some points the worst thing you can do is stop.
Yeah.
You gotta keep steady pressure on the gas pedal and just keep plowing through it. Because if you stop, you're going backward. If you're going through a muddy road or muddy lane, you can't stop. You just got to keep going, and you can't stop, because as soon as you let off the gas, boom, you're stuck. And I think that's where a lot of people find themselves in life. And some of them are in their 20s, and some of them are in their 70s, but they all have kind of the same problem. They're stuck. And if I was a psychologist and I was interviewing somebody or counseling with them, and they told me, I've always felt this way, and how old are you, 55? And you've always felt this way? So you started feeling this way when you were a teenager, and now you're 55 and you're still feeling this way. What does that say to you about your state of being in this particular case? It sounds like you're stuck, and you've been stuck since you were 17. And now you're 55 and you're still stuck, at least on this area, and I think it would be a crime to get that far in life before you realize that you've been stuck, and I think when people get stuck long enough, they just kind of pitch a tent and make it home.
Yeah.
Yeah. They just decide to live there.
Yeah. I think that would be a good place to start next week, talking about what it means to be stuck and how to get unstuck and what's that process, what's that look like, how do we get there.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
That'd be good.
Yeah, because next week's sermon is the Matthew 25 challenge, and we're going to be encouraging people to try to identify with people who are stuck. In a manner of speaking, they're stuck in a poverty situation. They have a life problem that they can't get out of, and we're going to try to identify with them so that we can help them. So it's a little bit of a stretch, but I think we can pull it off.
I think we can do it. There's that youthful, we got this.
And I'm the old guy saying, well, it might require a little bit of preparation, and we may have to zig and zag a few places, but I believe we can do it.
I'm counting on it.
All right, I guess we better wrap it up, huh?
Yeah. Bye, y'all.
See ya.